All right, my name is Samuel George, and this is going to be just a quick part five for assignment four. After recording this, I was just pretty rushed with the theoretical rankings of speed and didn't really talk about much of the theoretical behind it. Some of that is that the video goes more than like something like 700 seconds, then it just doesn't save, and I have to do it all over again. So, in the interest of time, I'll try to give a sort of a quick summary here. Just for the bottom part. If you felt like the last part was sufficient, you can just go ahead and stop now. So just to sort of discuss a little more in depth the rankings, again, we talk about the general trend of NIO being the fastest. This is because it's not blocking, RMI being the slowest since it is totally synchronous and therefore blocking, and Gypsy being almost a hybrid, whereas in atomic mode you see in a it's non behaves close to non-blocking, but not quite as efficient as something like NIO. And that trend of the three between the three modes seems to hold true, regardless of whether it's non-atomic or atomic. Again, local is really determined in all three cases by the rank. How long it takes the UI to respond. Because you see, when we go into headless mode and don't have to do any of the UI stuff, we get a much faster speeds. It takes almost no time at all. So then, most of the time, if you look at, say, for example, between, say, if local is sort of a wash based on whether it doesn't seem to matter if it's on two computers or not. That makes perfect sense because you still have to execute the same commands and you're not broadcasting anything. So it's irrelevant whether you're on separate computers or not. The big difference is when we see non-atomic versus atomic. So zooming in on this, in general, obviously non-atomic is almost always slower. This is a combination of the fact that you have to do your local commands and you have to intersperse your local commands with sending commands. So particularly if you're on a slower system, one processor system, you'll have to switch between doing your UI commands and doing your atomic. To sending it to the server, and then even if you ignore the server's response, you still have to check for it. So given how these all work, it makes sense that non-atomic is going to be much slower than atomic. Where you're just going to send to the server, and then when you get the messages back, this is, say, the time to get it back, and you can actually just pass the messages off directly to the other. Again, for NIO, we're very fast because we're actually not even worrying about the UI thread. We're just taking all the messages, sending them along, and that's how long this is. So this is really just the time to send all of the commands. This is even faster if you're on multiple computers, which makes sense because this when you're getting ready to send the messages, then the server since it's on the same machine, is actually going to pick up those same messages and have to echo them back to you, and you're going to have to do thread switching and context switching between this process, the NIO client process, and the server process. So even then, just receiving the messages from the NIO time is probably why it's much slower. And of course, our fastest thing is probably going to be two clients on separate servers with NIO, which is basically I'm just sending the messages and I'm completely unblocked. And it doesn't take hardly any time at all. It's just the time to send network messages. So that's why NIO, being completely non-blocking, is the fastest. Again, in Gypsy, your atomic calls, for example, are non-blocking. You can go ahead and send them all and then just wait for the response. So you can actually do some of the UI stuff, and we actually saw this in the demo a little bit. Movement occurring after this time actually popped out. That's because that process can finish and pass off to the AWT thread, and that's what lowers the time significantly for something like Gypsy and Atomic. You don't actually have to wait for the local commands. You can just send all the commands, get all the commands, get all the responses back, and pass it off immediately, as opposed to having to do that in something like RMI where you're going to have to block. So it makes sense that non-atomic, particularly in this case, on separate computers, the time it takes for atomic is how long it takes to send all those messages and get their responses. It makes sense that that plus your local time ends up being about your non-atomic, which is how much time if you do all of the movements and then broadcast your messages. So that makes good sense as well. So in general, of course, atomic is almost always going to be faster than particularly if there is no blocking, than non-atomic, simply because you have to deal with sending your messages as well as processing the AWT thread at the same time, as opposed to being able to separate those and do them without context switches in between. So that's generally why atomic is going to be faster. Again, pointing out that if you look at all of the messages here, we can see that the headless mode is actually much faster. So as it turns out, despite all the time that these things take, most of that time is actually just time for the UI. So we can see that within IO you get something even faster, and this was 0 several times, in the sense that this is basically just your time to send the messages. You don't even have to do anything when they come back. And they're on separate computers, so it makes sense. These are about the same because it's just the time to send messages. So the fact these two are the same makes sense. However, your local time drops to almost nothing, and therefore your non-atomic is going to speed up significantly for all the methods, mainly because your execution time here now locally is much slower, or is much reduced. I was surprised that Gypsy wasn't faster with this, but I guess it still does have to send the responses, and it does get bothered with what comes back. That is still, and then does have to pass it off in local. So I could see a situation, depending on how Gypsy's been implemented, you could get this faster. So overall, I think those are some of the general trends. Atomic is almost always faster than non-atomic. This makes sense because you can almost do all of your work at once. So you can send all your messages, for example, at once, and then as the server contacts you, you can ignore them and optimize by collecting those responses, et cetera, whereas you don't have to wait. And it makes sense that RMI non-atomic is the slowest overall, particularly on one computer, because it's basically you're trying to do local commands, you're trying to send all at once, and you're trying to deal with the server and pass out messages to other people at once and do the UI time for them as well. So you get, depending on the order in which things are done in the different threads, the computer's going to do some optimization and whatnot, and try to reduce these as much as possible. But overall, these trends do make good sense, and I think they illustrate how UI is very slow, and that network is actually can be very fast, even when you're waiting for a response. For example, you're on the order of, say, 2 seconds to send send 500 messages waiting. So you're looking at something like 4 milliseconds a message or something like that, which is not bad. So this just summarizes and elaborates for part 3. Again, if you were satisfied with the rankings in part 4, then you don't even have to watch.